I want to welcome all of our friends and family who are here tonight for Johnny Friends and Family Weekend. I hope you have a great time, and I'm looking forward to meeting more of you tomorrow. Tonight it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Mark Shiffman back to St. John's College. Dr. Shiffman is an alum of the Annapolis campus and currently an associate professor of philosophy at St. Patrick's Seminary in California. He received his doctorate from the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. He has a very extensive list of publications focused on many different authors, from Aristotle to Heidegger, Plutarch to de Tocqueville, Augustine to Weil. He is currently working on a book on the crisis of the modern state, violence, victimhood, and the problem of legitimacy. His lecture tonight is entitled Platonic Thumos and Rousseauan Amour-propre. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shiffman.
That's good. Thank you very much. I'm particularly grateful to President Pallman because my wife and I have a junior here, so we are here for Parents' Weekend as well, which we discovered a week ago when we were talking to our son. And he's, as I say, he's a junior, and we've been wanting to come to Parents' Weekend for a couple of years now and haven't made it, so here we are. Thank you very much for the invitation. When I asked my son whether he had any advice, having been to lectures here for a couple of years, as to what makes for a good lecture, he highly recommended that I have a PowerPoint slideshow with this lecture, so you can decide at the end of the lecture whether that was good advice or not. But here it is. I mean, that's not the whole presentation. Yeah. So I'm interested this evening in what might be called a question of political psychology, and in the different light cast on it by these two different authors. This inquiry involves us in something that students here spend a lot of time doing, which is reading and interpreting books. If a book is going to cast light on an aspect of reality that interests us, we have to ask of the book two questions simultaneously. What does it say? And what is it talking about? But to understand what a text says, we may need to read it in relation to other texts by the same author. And when we try to identify what it is talking about, we may find that our language for describing that subject is shaped by the influence of a different author, and that we have found ourselves in the middle of a longer dialogue across the centuries that we need to recapture and reconsider in order to find our bearings. So then we can identify four expanding circles of interpretation. First, a single text itself. Second, the author's works as a larger whole. Third, the long conversation with other authors. And fourth, the relationship of this implicit conversation to our own understanding of the world and of ourselves in relation to it. And this roughly sketches the path tonight's lecture will follow. I'll begin with a single text, Plato's Republic, and we'll consider a single text in conversation with it, Rousseau's Second Discourse. But we'll also consider how the terms of that conversation and the significance of this text of Rousseau only become evident when we interpret the Second Discourse within a larger set of Rousseauan texts. And finally, what is at stake in this conversation can only be evident to us if we consider the political realities on which these different treatments of comparable passions should cast a clarifying light. So these are our circles, our spheres of interpretive scope, so to speak. Now, to try to focus all this a little bit more at the outset, I'm going to start with a third author who I'm not really going to talk about, and a particular moment in our political history and in my own life as a reader and thinker. Just about this time in my senior year here in Annapolis, November 1989, the Berlin Wall began to be dismantled, an event which soon became a symbol of the end of the Cold War and the collapse of Soviet communism. A few months earlier, an article had been published by the political theorist Francis Fukuyama, which later in 1992 was expanded into a book called The End of History and the Last Man. For a St. John's graduate interested in world politics, the exciting thing about this book was that Fukuyama argued not only that liberal democracy was the ultimate destination of political history, but that if we were to understand why, we should look to Hegel's phenomenology, which seniors here were reading about a month ago, I think. According to Fukuyama, the central driver of political history is a phenomenon mostly ignored in modern political thought, what Hegel calls the desire for recognition. And Fukuyama treats this desire for recognition as equivalent to what Plato called Thumos and what Rousseau called Amour-propre. In other words, it turned out that the key to understanding the most significant developments in contemporary world politics was a theme ignored by most contemporary thinkers and commentators, but very familiar to any Johnny, which of course was a very exciting idea for a recent alum planning to study political philosophy. But after 20 years or so of using Plato and Rousseau to try to understand political phenomena, I'm convinced that Fukuyama was mistaken. Not about the importance of Thumos, but about equating it so simply to amour-propre in Rousseau and to the derivative Hegelian concept of the desire for recognition. So in one sense, I'm also kind of conducting you through my own second thoughts about Thumos and the desire for recognition and what they have to do with the significance of the last 30 years of world history. So let's begin with Thumos in the Republic. As you may recall, and I hope you do if you're a freshman because you just read this, in the second book of the Republic, when Socrates begins describing the just city in speech, his first description of the city as a rustic town with songs around the fire for entertainment and figs and beans for dessert meets with scorn from Glaucon, who calls it a city fit for pigs and not for human beings if their life is going to be something more than mere drudgery. Why the natural city of subsistence farming is not enough for Glaucon is an interesting question, but we'll have to leave that one aside for now. But it leads the city in speech to a need for excess production, more land, and soldiers to conquer the land and defend the wealth of this luxurious city. With this new type of citizen, Thumos becomes an explicit theme of the dialogue. In considering what kind of nature or phusis these warriors will need, Socrates proposes that if they are to be courageous, they must be spirited. He says, "Haven't you noticed how irresistible and unbeatable spirit is, so that its presence makes every soul fearless and invincible in the face of everything?" The word he uses here for spirited is thumoedes, thumoform, or the thumotic type. It's noteworthy that the examples Socrates provides of this trait are animals. He asks, will horse or dog or any other animal whatsoever be willing to be courageous if it's not spirited? So thumos seems to be natural in a twofold and ambiguous sense. Some people are just more that type than others, but the same is true of animals. It first comes into account as a source of courage, but also of determination not to be defeated, and as something not exclusively human. And I emphasize this last point because it distinguishes Platonic Thumos from Rousseauan Amour-propre, which is distinctively human. And so, even though we're trying to interpret the Republic on its own terms, the question we bring to it and the larger dialogue we are reading it within sharpens our attention for some details more than others. With the introduction of this spirited type into the city, Socrates confronts a problem. Will these fierce warriors also be savage and domineering toward their fellow citizens? We might call it the police brutality problem. This problem launches Socrates into the discussion of education that extends through Book 3, in which he proposes to harmonize the souls of the warriors through a combination of gymnastic and music. As in Sparta, the thumotic nature will acquire discipline and firmness through exertion and physical training. But it will also acquire grace, measure, and appreciation for rational order through poetry and the other arts. Exclusively physical training on its own is bad education because it produces precisely the harshness and proneness to violence Socrates is concerned to prevent. This we might call the hyperdevelopment of Thumos. On the other hand, Socrates also considers the ill effects of one-sidedly musical education. If a man who has a spirited soul spends his whole life humming and exulting in song, then the spirit is weakened and made temperamental, quickly inflamed by little things and quickly extinguished. Thus, these men have become quick-tempered and irritable from having been spirited, and they are filled with discontent. How the thumotic types manifest themselves in the city depends on how their education, or as we would say culture, forms them, and how the life of the city directs and channels Thumos. If we look to our own cultural and political life, saturated with entertainment and accusatory media, we can easily see how prevalent this temperamental manifestation of Thumos, quickly inflamed by little things and quickly extinguished, can become, and how troublesome it can be politically. And here we see how the questions we bring to the text, animated by a desire for light on our reality, also sharpens our attention to significant details we might not otherwise dwell on. After showing how a good education tempers the soul of the thumotic type, Socrates is able to do what he proposed when he set out to describe the city in speech. He can use the order in the city to help make manifest the order within the soul. If we were to describe the way Thumos has been presented up to this point in the dialogue, we might say that it has emerged as a factor that must somehow be dealt with, given shape and direction, and thus made useful and safe for the city. We might think of it as one particularly significant passion among many passions. As Socrates tries to bring the city-soul analogy into focus, however, Thumos comes to light as one of the principal elements of order and dynamics of both city and soul, and perhaps as the crucial principle for enabling us to see the order and dynamics of both with clarity. It is at this point that Socrates turns from political order to psychological order, and the question arises explicitly whether we can adequately understand order in the soul in terms of two principles, reasoning and appetite, in which case we would include Thumos among the appetites, or whether Thumos is a principle or power distinct from and of comparable importance to these two others. And Socrates argues for the latter. So here in Book 4, Thumos becomes a phenomenon or a constellation of phenomena to contemplate in its distinctness. So then how does Socrates distinguish it from appetites? To get at the distinctiveness of Thumos, Socrates tells the story of the Athenian Leontius, who tried to resist the urge to look at the corpses of recently slain men as he was walking past the place of public execution. When he ultimately gives in, he berates his own wide-open eyes as he runs toward the corpses. "Look, you damned wretches, take your fill of the fair sight." Socrates highlights the implication that anger sometimes makes war against the desires as one thing against something else. He points to anger, or orge, as a thumotic phenomenon and distinguishes it from appetite, epithumia, as he had promised to do. Leontius is angry at himself, or at his I as a part of himself, because he tried to resist this urge and failed. He has failed to act with self-command, failed to act with unity or integrity, and failed to act as someone committed to the truly noble would act. When Leontius treats his eyes as if they were an unruly part of himself, whose desires are contemptible, he manifests several different aspects of Thumos that Socrates will highlight to different degrees. In this conflict within the soul, Thumos takes the side of reason's judgment of what is noble or not. It shows itself in the form of anger and in the tonality of contempt, and it is intensified by the shame of one's own failure of self-mastery. Now, showing itself this way through division in the soul helps us to see its distinctness, but if we imagine the reverse of these manifestations, we can begin to see other faces of Thumos in a more orderly soul. Well-ordered Thumos enforces a consistency between judgment and action, resulting in self-mastery and self-rule, in firmness of purpose rather than anger at oneself, in love of honor and virtue rather than in contempt for baseness, at least in oneself, and thus in pride rather than shame. Socrates also observes that a man who recognizes that he has done injustice will endure the sufferings of punishment rather than turn his Thumos against the punisher. And in this case, Thumos seems to be telling him both that he merits this treatment for his defection from the good, and that the one causing his suffering is not insulting his dignity, but rather representing the rational judgment about the good. And thus, Thumos sustains the punished man in his commitment to enduring suffering for the sake of the good. Conversely, when a man is treated unjustly, Socrates says, his Thumos will boil and become harsh and form an alliance for battle with what seems just. And even if it suffers in hunger, cold, and everything of the sort, doesn't it stand firm and conquer and not cease from its noble efforts before it has succeeded or before it becomes gentle? Here, we have a whole constellation of phenomena that suggest both the distinctness of Thumos and the complexity and multiplicity of its manifestations. Anger, harshness, vengefulness, contempt, shame, pride, determination, endurance, self-mastery, a sense of dignity, attachment to and zeal for what is just and good, courage in the face of what is fearsome. This is a whole different motivational sphere from the desire for pleasures and the aversion to pains. Finally, at least in the Republic for our purposes, the complexity of this array of thumotic phenomena further increases in Book 8, when Socrates turns back to look again at the city and its different orderings, the timocratic, the oligarchic, the democratic, and the tyrannical regimes. Here in the political order, the concern for honor and the kind of person honored by the regime take center stage. Because the type of man honored in a city channels Thumos toward different soul orderings, through different ways of attaching and forming it, we could say that each city has a distinct kind of thumotic economy. The timocratic city celebrates the most straightforward expressions of Thumos itself: love of victory and of ruling, of military virtue, of athletic competition, and of hunting. But the oligarch has a different thumotic form: a self-command of all the appetites that would interfere with the ambitious pursuit of wealth, a kind of ascetic self-denial, delayed gratification, pride in enduring deprivation for the sake of competitive success, honor for relentless hard work, and contempt for idleness and for the poor, and the urge to display one's wealth for others to see, admire, and envy, but not spend too much of it doing so. The democratic soul, on the other hand, takes pride in living according to its own desires. This one's for the parents. And rebels against any authority that would criticize it on the basis of a standard of what is good or well ordered. It is harsh against any claim of one person or type of person to be better than another. And it rejects the idea that anyone should be ashamed, and indeed takes pride in this rejection of shame as a kind of victory over limitations on equality and as an assertion of freedom. And finally, the tyrant takes pride in domination of all others and in the freedom to act contrary to anything that has the character of law or limitation. And he is harsh and cruel to anyone who disobeys, disagrees, or calls into question his dominion and superiority by asserting their own freedom or upholding a standard of virtue, which of course raises a significant and timely question for us about our own situation. Which I leave you. Go and read that part of the Republic, see what you think. These different thumotic economies of the different polities thus bring into view aspects of thumos that manifest themselves in distinctly political ways, such as love of victory, ambition, love of freedom, or the desire to dominate and humiliate. They also, perhaps especially in the oligarchic polity, bring to light what may be one of the most basic manifestations of thumos, the ability to commit to a goal and to resist the appeal of whatever distracts from it. This goal-oriented commitment is necessary for things like, say, craft production, which means that thumos would have been already present in this form in the original rustic city even before it becomes distinctly visible and politically problematic in the militarized city. And with a view to the longer conversation part of interpretation, this might suggest that the Platonic psychology has something to offer the philosophy of labor we find in modern authors like John Locke and Karl Marx. Also with a view to the longer conversation, and specifically to the conversation with Rousseau, it's worth noting that thumos appears in Plato within the framework of the pursuit of the good. One of its most typical manifestations, both in the Republic and in the Symposium, is love of honor, which is a kind of desire for excellence. And it is within this framework of the pursuit of the good that its better and worse, healthy and pathological forms are recognized. We might say, by way of anticipation, that the abandonment of this framework accounts for much of the difference between thumos and amour-propre. And so, with that, let us turn to Rousseau. The Rousseauan text most relevant to our inquiry is his discourse on the origins and foundations of inequality. And on the basis of this title, we can infer at least two differences from the political inquiry of the Republic. First, it appears that if justice is in question, as it is in the Republic, it will be narrowed to the question of inequality, which already places the emphasis not on a good to be desired, but on a source of dissatisfaction. Second, the inquiry will be directed to origins. As Rousseau puts it, he will be offering us a kind of history of the human species. The combination of these two emphases in a history that shows us the origins of a source of dissatisfaction is decisive for understanding the centrality of Amour-propre to Rousseau's political psychology. Identifying the problem history introduces into human social existence will enable Rousseau to imagine a solution, and the terms of that solution will hinge upon the satisfaction of Amour-propre. This hypothetical history begins by stripping away everything we observe in human beings that results from modifications of their original undeveloped faculties and their pre-social qualities, and requires us to imagine what precedes all this. What Rousseau offers us then is a description of a proto-human who differs from the other animals only in certain potentialities, and he provides speculations regarding how those potentialities get activated and developed. On the whole, Rousseau claims to see in natural man an animal less strong than some, less agile than others, but all things considered, the most advantageously organized of all. Satisfying his hunger under an oak, quenching his thirst at the first stream, finding his bed at the foot of the same tree that furnished his meal, and therewith his needs are satisfied. The first, crucially distinctive thing Rousseau sees in the human animal is what he calls perfectibility, which is to say a kind of malleability, the capacity to change and acquire new characteristics. Combine this with a capacity for imitation, and this malleability enables the human animal to acquire the instincts, activities, and food sources it observes in other animals, and to become a kind of omnicompetent animal. This is its first great advantage over the other animals, and its recognition of this advantage is the origin of self-consciousness. Rousseau remarks, "The new enlightenment that resulted from this development increased his superiority over the other animals by making him aware of his superiority. Thus the first glance he directed upon himself produced in him the first stirring of pride. Thus, as yet scarcely knowing how to distinguish ranks, and considering himself in the first rank as a species, he prepared himself from afar to claim first rank as an individual." And here we have the birth of Amour-propre, which may be the decisive event in Rousseau's hypothetical history, right? The love of one's own person, in a sense, right? Self-awareness. But this event is not initially decisive, because our self-consciousness initially is easily satisfied. First, by this evident superiority over other animals, and then, in the tribal village, by the actual capacities in which one person is slightly better at something than others and is valued for that by the community. The activation of Amour-propre seems to give rise to the distinction between, on the one hand, contentment, such as the natural man feels in the gratification of his appetites and the simple sentiment of his own existence, and on the other hand, happiness, which Rousseau attributes to the tribal savage man, whose period in human history he describes as the happiest and most durable epoch. Its happiness seems to result from the fact that Amour-propre is active, but also easily gratified on stable and indisputable grounds. By contrast, in the intensely status-conscious, fashionable French society of his own time, Rousseau sees Amour-propre as a principal source of misery and disgusting vanity. And this, we might say, is a key to the problem that inequality introduces into human history, according to Rousseau. With inequality, Amour-propre becomes a source of dissatisfaction. And if this is the problem, then we have the outline of what the solution needs to be. Civilized or political man needs a form of communal life that results in a stably satisfied self-consciousness. So at this point, we can sharpen the contrast with Plato. For Rousseau, the political problem is fundamentally about contriving and instituting a remedy for a basic human dissatisfaction. And thus, Amour-propre is not fundamentally a desire for something, as Thumos seems to be. Rather, its satisfaction is a pleasure that arises as an accident of our historical and psychological development, a pleasure that we only recognize and notice our attachment to when we are deprived of it, when we are pained by an unsatisfied self-consciousness. In other words, Amour-propre is just another source of pleasure and pain, not a different kind of motivational structure from the appetites, but one with different sources, mainly in the opinion we know others have of us and its effect on the opinion we are able to have of ourselves. But now that we have acquired amour-propre and are stuck with it, it has become the source of pleasure central to human happiness. Thus, the basic shape of amour-propre as the problem of human history emerges from the discourse on inequality. But the solution does not. Rousseau does, however, point toward it in that text when he insists that once human beings enter into a civil condition, only the citizens of republics are able to attain happiness and virtue. So this is where, to piece together the meaning and the rationale of this claim in Rousseau, we will need to turn to other works of his, mainly The Social Contract and the encyclopedia article on political economy. In the first chapter of The Social Contract, Rousseau indicates in a famous phrase that he is describing the solution to the problem of human history. Quote, "Man was born free, and everywhere he is in chains. How did this change occur? I do not know. What can make it legitimate? I believe I can answer this question." This suggests that giving legitimacy to our civil condition is the key to the solution. But the article on political economy indicates that the problem of legitimacy is not a theoretical question so much as a question of political psychology, with amour-propre at its center. So let's begin then by considering this psychological problem. According to Rousseau's political economy, the citizen's love of his homeland enables him to transform into a sublime virtue the dangerous disposition from which all our vices arise, that dangerous disposition being amour-propre. It is certain, he says, that the greatest miracles of virtue have been produced by patriotism, by combining the force of amour-propre with all the beauty of virtue. This sweet and ardent sentiment gains an energy which, without disfiguring it, makes it the most heroic of all the passions. In other words, the aim in forming the devoted citizen is not at all the elimination of amour-propre, but rather rendering it beautiful by giving it the form of virtue. But what does Rousseau mean by virtue? He goes on to tell us, every man is virtuous when his private will conforms on all matters with the general will. Rousseau expands upon this thought. If you want the laws to be obeyed, make them beloved, so that for men to do what they should, they need only think they ought to do it. That was the great art of the governments of antiquity. Do you want the general will to be fulfilled? Make sure that all private wills are related to it. And since virtue is only this conformity of the private will to the general, to say the same thing briefly, make virtue reign. All right, well, these are all astounding claims. To make this idea a bit more vivid, it's helpful to look at a passage from Rousseau's Émile, his book on education. So another text to draw into this conversation. In describing the aim of citizen education, Rousseau says the following. Good social institutions are those that best know how to denature man, to take his absolute existence from him in order to give him a relative one, and transport the I into the common unity, with the result that each individual believes himself no longer one, but a part of the unity and no longer feels except within the whole. And then he gives us a couple examples drawn from Plutarch. The Lacedaemonian Pedaritus runs for the Council of the 300. He is defeated. He goes home delighted that there were 300 men worthier than he to be found in Sparta. This is the citizen. A Spartan woman had 5 sons and was awaiting news of the battle. A helot arrives trembling. She asks him for news. Your 5 sons were killed. Base slave, did I ask you that? We won the victory. The mother runs to the temple and gives thanks to the gods. This is the female citizen. With respect to the transformation of Amour-propre into civic virtue, we might take these two anecdotes drawn from Plutarch as a Rousseauan counterpoint to the anecdote of Leontius in the Republic. They help us to understand what Rousseau means by the general will, a term so puzzling in the social contract. What makes the citizen a citizen is an absolute obedience to the law, which is to say, to the general will. But this general will doesn't simply pre-exist the will of the citizen, but is rather the consequence of what we might call the generalizing of the will into an absolute commitment to the public whole. And one crucial way of accomplishing this generalizing of the will is the republican manner of lawmaking. This is why Rousseau insists on republics. And here we return to the social contract. The most significant legislating takes the form of ratification by the citizen body. I've used this picture from painter David, which is painted a few years before the French Revolution, but certainly influenced by Rousseau's notion of the republican citizens. This is a famous story, the Oath of the Horatii, from the beginning of the Roman Republic. Certainly influenced by Rousseau. So, republican manner of lawmaking. The most significant legislating in a republic takes the form of ratification by the citizen body. When the entire people enacts something concerning the entire people, it considers only itself. Remember the two Rousseaus looking at each other. And if a relationship is formed, then it is between the whole object viewed in one way and the whole object viewed in another, without any division of the whole. Then the subject matter of the enactment is general, like the will that enacts. It is this act that I call a law. I therefore call every state ruled by laws a republic. Every legitimate government is republican. Right, so here we have the core of what Rousseau means by legitimacy and what the substructure of that is that goes all the way down to the Amour-propre that becomes generalized. Because of this self-legislation in the public assembly, where the citizens gaze upon their polity as a body of fellow citizens, and are in turn gazed upon as citizens of the polity, they enact and sustain the sense that they are free. Because according to Rousseau, freedom is obedience to the law one has prescribed for oneself. Thus, the republican form of association is one in which each one, uniting with all, nevertheless obeys only himself. Both the sense of obeying only oneself and the sense of responsible commitment to the whole public body provide Amour-propre with firm foundations and of satisfaction. So then that state is legitimate, which satisfies the Amour-propre of the citizens by giving them the solid sense that they obey only themselves as a whole. He says in the social contract, everything that destroys social unity is worthless. All institutions that put man in contradiction with himself are worthless. Legitimate institutions are those, for Rousseau, that make man whole and society unified, and these two requirements are ultimately one. Now, by drawing these threads together, we can begin to understand legitimacy and the virtue and happiness of the republican citizen. A state is legitimate if it is republican. It is republican if it is ruled by laws. It is only ruled by laws when it is ruled by what the entire people enacts concerning the entire people. Then there is a general will expressed in law. And when the particular will of the citizen coincides entirely with this general will, the citizen is virtuous because his or her Amour-propre has taken the beautiful form of patriotic virtue and is satisfied by the freedom of obeying only oneself. And then one final key to the generalizing of the citizen wills for Rousseau is egalitarianism, which returns us to the origin of dissatisfaction identified in the second discourse. This insistence on equality is not moralistic. Rather, equality is a formal requirement of the civic satisfaction of amour-propre, a condition of the perfect reciprocity of ruling and being ruled. Most of the familiar pathological forms that amour-propre takes result from the need to gratify and impress those on whom we feel dependent for our self-image. In the self-legislating republic, all are equally and impersonally the authors and the subjects of the criteria of devoted citizen excellence. In aligning my will with the law that I have given myself as part of the whole, I proudly identify with the whole. My will as citizen is only the general will, and I am satisfied with my freedom and with the legitimacy of my state. Like the natural man, the citizen is whole, but with the additional happiness made possible and necessary by amour-propre. And this, again, looking to the longer conversation, finally, this basic formula that the problem of human history is resolved by a form of satisfied self-consciousness will have a very long afterlife. We see variations of it in the historical progressivism of Kant, of Hegel, of Marx, of Fukuyama, as well as in some guiding principles of US and European foreign policy today. So, I will conclude with 3 observations, 1 suggestion, 1 question, and 1 proposal. First observation. Socrates in the Republic provides in speech a vision of orderliness in city and soul that gives shape and direction to our desire for the good. But in the end, Socrates acknowledges that the city in speech is unlikely to exist in fact, and if it did, it would depend almost entirely on chance, on the unlikely coinciding of wisdom and rule. Rousseau might or might not be doubtful about the possibility of a legitimate republic existing in the modern world, but his rhetoric reinforces the logic of his claim that all polities that fail to meet his criteria are illegitimate and fail to resolve the dissatisfaction inflicted upon us by history. So while the city of Plato's Republic moderates our hopes from political order and brings to light the ways in which Thumos finds partial satisfaction in the different kinds of regime, the legitimate republic described by Rousseau seems to heighten our dissatisfaction and to lay the groundwork in the imagination and the passions for permanent revolution. Second observation. Platonic Thumos is seen within this framework of desire for the good, and thus is presented as both fueling our pursuit of the good and our attachment to it, and as directed toward its proper fulfillment in the good order of the soul. Rousseauan amour-propre comes to light rather as a source of dissatisfaction within a hedonistic framework of pleasure and pain, a dissatisfaction that drives us negatively to some final remedy that will provide us with a satisfied self-consciousness. Third observation. As fundamentally a form of self-consciousness, amour-propre operates entirely in the sphere of feeling and opinion. It seems potentially separable from our bodily existence. Thumos, on the other hand, is also visceral and animal, and its implicit fundamental form seems to be a kind of self-command involved in the most common of deliberate and disciplined activities. Its satisfaction would seem then to require some kind of integration of action, thought, and feeling that involves excellence in practical bodily life, perhaps in military or public service or in labor. Thumos then, in some sense, would seem inherently to yearn for virtue of a kind that integrates one's whole person, perfecting one's nature as a rational, choosing and acting being. Hence, a suggestion. If amour-propre depends upon an approval of myself, sustained by my knowledge that others also approve of me, might it not be satisfied with something like what we call virtue signaling? which is to say, holding and showing that I hold acceptable opinions that enable me to approve of myself because I believe that others approve of me, and that we share and affirm the criteria of devotion to, say, egalitarian self-legislation. And thus, a question. Can the internet, by means of which we form communities of mutual approval of one another's virtuous opinions, fulfill the role of a kind of substitute for Rousseau's Republican Assembly, forming a virtual community convinced of its exclusive legitimacy and mutually satisfying the self-consciousness of its citizens through the belief that they continually self-legislate the criteria of their virtue and are continually seen by one another doing so. And finally, a proposal. If we adopt the form of Platonic analysis that I'm calling the discernment and description of thumotic economies, then we might characterize this Rousseauan political psychology as a reduction of thumotic phenomena to a form of self-consciousness. And we might suspect that this reduction acquires its verisimilitude and its plausibility from the fact that it reflects a certain thumotic economy within which we increasingly live. This would be a thumotic economy in which we are physically protected by others, which we might describe as the modern security state, and in which very few of us do the kind of work that is humanly integrative and character-forming, which we might describe as a post-industrial economy. If some form of the Rousseauan political psychology is right, then we might expect such a thumotic economy to be able to attain a stably satisfying form. But if it's not, if the Platonic understanding of Thumos is right, then probably we should expect a thumotic economy that tries to satisfy us merely with gratifying forms of self-consciousness to end up actually breeding dissatisfactions that it is incapable of either containing or reckoning with. And I propose that this somewhat describes our current political climate in the West. And if you care to stick around, you can let me know how that strikes you. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here.